technically the moderator. My name is Dorothy Burlage. But the fact is that this would not have happened without incredible input from everyone on this panel who has contributed ideas, a way to think about it, how to frame it, who to involve, etc. They have been absolutely fantastic. And by the way, they have much more experience chairing panels than I do. So I'm turning this over to them as quickly as possible. Especially Heather, the organizer par excellence. And the first thing I want to say, in addition to thanking this panel, these incredible women, is that I think Deborah Bell is amazing.
I have been thanked so much. I so appreciate it. I think I'm getting about 97% of the credit, more than I deserve. I think what I really did was I just didn't say no,
Well, it worked. I would say that she's been very patient, supportive, and gracious, and coordinating 50 years of people from all over the country with opinions and prejudices.
That's mine. It's right here.
So this panel was an effort to go back to the early civil rights movement and see how women's issues developed from that period of time. And actually, the conference is labeled as mid-60s, but Dorie, she didn't say that I was going to say this, but Dorie became this is Dorie Ladner on my side, from Mississippi, became active when Emmett Till was murdered. And I think she was 13 at the time. And Mary King came to the South, was from the South actually, was from Virginia, and was active from probably the late 50s or early 60s.
I got involved at Ohio Wesleyan University, organizing student support for the sit-ins.
Okay, and Heather came to Mississippi in '64 and continued into the New Left and then the women's movement. Now I'm going to say more about each one, but I want to ask first, how many people in the audience were actually involved in the civil rights movement?
Yay!
And how many are so young that they have only read about it? There are only 5 of you all. So anytime we use jargon or the names of organizations that don't make sense or acronyms, say so and we'll define them, I guess. And I want to give just a short introduction about each person. Dorie Ladner, well, in terms of the framework of the panel, Dorie Ladner as an Dorie Ladner as an African-American woman who stood up to the Ku Klux Klan to fight for her rights was a role model for the rest of us. That's Dorie. Mary King, who wrote what historian Clay Carson described as one of the first salvos of the women's movement when she wrote this paper, we called it the Women's Memo at the time, Sex and Caste, which was copied for everyone in the audience. I hope everyone has one. And Heather Booth, who built on the insights from Dorie and Mary and helped carry forward the SNCC legacy into the New Left and into the women's movement. What they all have in common, in my opinion, is the most amazing courage, commitment, and vision. They are all women who made history and influenced the development of the women's movement. I'm not really sure that we would be here having the same discussions without these 3 women. Now a brief intro on each person, and then we'll have each one present, and we're going to try to save a lot of time for questions and answers and participation at the end, because there are all these movement people in the room.
What about you?
Much less younger people. Well, I didn't have as much courage.
Please.
Anyway, I'll tell you briefly in a second. First, Dorie Ladner was born in Hattiesburg and grew up in Palmer's Crossing, Mississippi. Population what, 500?
Yes.
500. She came from a large extended family with a mother who was a very strong lady and trained her to always stand up for herself. Because of segregation, she had to go 90 miles north to college. She went to Jackson State, and she'll explain more of this later probably, but she was kicked out of Jackson State because of her involvement in the civil rights movement. Then she transferred to Tougaloo College, where she was in and out depending on her activist activities. She met Diane Nash and other freedom riders, began doing community organizing with the civil rights movement in Jackson, worked in the Freedom Office doing nonviolent community organizing. In her sophomore year in 1962, Dorie met Bob Moses and began working with SNCC. She met Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, our heroine of the era. She dropped out of college 5 times.
Three.
Excuse me, 3 times. But she went on to get a master's in social work and at Howard, and she's now retired. So that's Dorie. Mary King has a CV that I could talk about for at least 30 minutes, so I'm not allowed to do that. She, most importantly, in my experience, was in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Wait, I skipped. Let me go back to Mary. She worked for SNCC for 4 years in Danville, Virginia, Mississippi, and Atlanta. She directed the Peace Corps under the Carter administration. She worked with President Carter for 43 years, since 1970. She's professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University for Peace and affiliate of the United Nations. She did that for 16 years. She's a fellow at Oxford. She's affiliated with American University in Washington, D.C., and lo and behold, she's published 5 books. Heather is the organizer par excellence. Don't let her get close to you. She'll get you doing something. She went to work for SNCC in Mississippi in 1964, and then, being the good kid that she was, when Dr. King said that the way to secure civil rights was through labor rights, she became a labor organizer in Chicago. She won a back pay suit through the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, and with that money started the Midwest Academy, Training Academy, which trained literally hundreds of thousands of organizers and thousands of organizations, such as the NAACP, the Sierra Club, the Planned Parenthood organization, La Raza, on and on and on and on. Hundreds of thousands of people became organizers through Heather's training. In 1980, when Reagan was elected, and she started then to work on elections. She trained organizations to be involved in electoral politics. I might say on the side that she was involved in getting the African American vote out in Florida, which became the place that the campaign floundered for the Democrats, and because blacks were not allowed to vote, basically.
In 2000.
2008.
2000.
Since then, she's been involved in large-scale issue campaigns, the NAACP National Vote Fund, the AFL-CIO Healthcare Campaign, financial reform, marriage equality, immigration campaigns is what she's doing now, and she'll speak about the civil rights movement and the women's movement. I'm going to do me really briefly. I was born in Texas, raised in Mississippi, reared in Mississippi, and learned to be a segregationist and obey the Jim Crow laws before I learned my ABCs or Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. And grew up in that world. My family was segregationist, and then I broke away. I worked in the civil rights movement. I worked in SDS, and I worked in the women's movement, and I'm now a psychologist. That's my story.
Let me borrow the microphone. She founded the Northern Student Movement. She worked on organizing SOC, the Southern Student Organizing Committee. She organized in Anacostia, Washington, which is Washington's Black Ghetto, and Stokely Carmichael and Ralph Featherstone were some of the people who worked under her, and lots of other things.
Thank you, Gary. Okay. So Dorie's on.
We are all modest. We talk to the enemies.
Put the microphone close to your mouth so we can hear.
My sight is beginning to fail, and this is one thing that disturbs me about aging.
Maybe your sight, but never her vision.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank Boston University. I want to thank everybody here. Coming from Mississippi, which is still the poorest state in the union and has the highest incidences of everything from poverty to obesity to healthcare disparities, ignorance. They still burn books. I can't begin to enumerate all the things that are present day in 2014. And I was born in 1942 in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, reared in Palmer's Crossing.
Tech support.
That's better.
Okay, thank you. I was born in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. My parents were Annie Ruth Woolard and Eunice Ladner. They were divorced by the time I was 2. My sister Joyce was born a year and a half after I was born. I lived with my maternal grandparents, Joe and Martha Woolard, and my mother's siblings. Mother was the 5th of 11 children. When my mother remarried, we moved in with into my mother's home in Palmer's Crossing. Palmer's Crossing was a black community 5 miles from Hattiesburg. The population was about 500 or 600. Palmer's had the dichotomy of being a very religious community and also one that sold liquor and entertained the GIs from Camp Shelby. The sheriff would come every Monday and collect his money from one side of the street to the other, Sheriff Finch, and go back uptown. And I observed this. Sometimes he would go into the homes of some of the women and spend a little time. A lot of people sold bootleg liquor. I don't know if you're familiar with White Lightning and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Mississippi was supposed to be a dry state, but the liquor was flowing. And I also grew up listening to the jukeboxes. You could play your music as loud as you wanted to. And on the radio, I only heard Hank Williams Jr., Doris Day, and other singers. And the blues, which I have a great appreciation for, was blasted in the jukeboxes, Big Maybell and all these people. So I have passions for certain kinds of music. But I love music, period. The schools that I attended were segregated. We never had new books. I don't ever recall having a new textbook. The kids from the white schools had their names in them, so we memorized the names of a lot of kids. Sometimes there would be 5 names in one book. And we never had new equipment, but the community was very supportive, and also our teachers were very caring. And we prevailed in spite of this lack of support from the establishment. Our parents were paying taxes like the other parents. I was the eldest of 8 in the home. My mother was, I was the eldest of 8 in the home, and I had to do chores like child care. And one thing that I made a point of was never learning to cook or sew. I hated home economics. I got thumped in the forehead because I couldn't put a hem in a skirt, and I didn't want to. The girls were busy running around making a pound cake. I could care less, and I still hate these cooking shows on television. I don't know what that is all about. Every show you turn on, there's a cooking show. I hate them. I do, I really do. My mother, bless her heart, started teaching us when we were very young. My nickname is Dot. She said, Dot, when you're talking to a white person, always look them in the eyes. I was probably 3 or 4 years old, never look down. I didn't understand then, but as I got older, I started to understand. And a lot of us have been taught by our parents things that we only began to understand when we get much, much older. Mother was right. You say, Mama was right. Daddy was right. But it takes a long time, especially when you don't want to hear it. But in the community, in the state that I grew up in, there was so much blatant racism. I would go downtown, we'd catch the city bus, go downtown. We had to sit in the rear of the bus. The bus driver was a racist from his heart. He yelled the N-word. We went to Sears and Roebuck and Company. It was called Sears Roebuck and Company at that time. Bathrooms were white ladies and colored women. Black water fountain, white water fountain. You couldn't sit down in Woolworth. You could stand up and get some candy. You couldn't, I don't ever remember buying a float. But I always daydreamed about what it was like outside of my community. And have any of you heard of Highway 49?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, Highway 49 bypasses Palmer's Crossing going to New Orleans. And Highway 49 and Highway 11 would take my parents and many friends and community people to Charity Hospital in New Orleans. We had to go to Charity Hospital for medical care because the city of Hattiesburg did not provide immediate medical care, emergency care. So on many dark nights and before day in the morning, many people had to travel to New Orleans, which was about 80 or 90 miles from Hattiesburg for medical care. And I was really disturbed when Charity had to close down after Katrina. But that was our only source of health care. And you can imagine, my grandmother was a medicine woman. She knew how to make medicine. She was Native American and black ancestry and white ancestry. She would make medicine, but many of our people had to survive with natural medicine until, you know, the advent of current medicine, because you had to be treated wherever you were and with your resources. So my brother would go with my grandmother to dig up medicine. All my mother's siblings knew how to go into the woods with my grandmother and get the medicine, the roots to make the medicine. After graduating from Earl Trevilian High School, I had to go 90 miles north to Jackson State, because in Hattiesburg you had two colleges, University of Southern Mississippi, which had denied Clyde Kennard the right to enter. He was sentenced to 7 years in hard labor at Parchment Penitentiary for attempting to enroll. And he died shortly after he was released upon orders of then Attorney General Robert Kennedy. And he died in 1963. I went to William Carey College. William Carey was there, but we couldn't attend. So getting to Jackson State, joined in solidarity with fraternities and sororities. James Meredith was there, was one of the strategists on campus, and I was at a natural drawing to people who were active for some reason. It was in my DNA, I guess, and I joined in solidarity with students there, especially with the sororities and fraternities. And Medgar Evers' office was across the street from Jackson State. On Wednesdays, we had free time. We could go across the street and talk to Mr. Evers about our freedom, but I really didn't know what it meant. He told us that our parents paid taxes and we had the right to streets, and we had street lights, and they had the right to vote, but this was abstract. I was like 18 years old, and I met Mr. Evers earlier because Vernon Damer's sister would take us back and forth to NAACP meetings when I was 14 years old, and mentioning Emmett Till, I saw the picture of Emmett Till, and it just left an imprint on my mind. So that started me. So after Jackson State, we joined in solidarity with students from Tulu who had attempted to sit in the public library, and they were arrested. And I didn't want Jackson State anymore because we were expelled for praying in the dorm. I don't know how, coming from Palmer's Crossing, which had the church and the school, I don't know why I was a threat to the school, the Jackson State. And I later learned that the president was related to my mother, but you know, things happen. And we had been told that the Freedom Riders were coming, but I didn't know what they meant. It said somebody was coming to help us get our freedom. And I said, oh, our freedom? Oh, mine. And so I wanted to get my freedom. We went to Tulu College, went to the mansion. Dr. Bible, who was white, Tulu had a long history with the United Church of Christ, had white faculty. Dr. Bible, white president, was there, and we met with them, and it was told that we couldn't join in because we would be arrested and by the state, and we would be incarcerated probably in the state penitentiary. But the Tulu students, which was a private college, they would be bond would be posted for them, and they would be taken care of by the school. So Dr. Ryder, a white professor from Mississippi State, said have a prayer meeting. We had a prayer meeting on campus, And the president came out and started flailing his arms, knocked my sister Joyce's roommate down, and brought the dogs on campus the next morning. I couldn't believe that. I'd never seen a canine dog before. I didn't know they existed. So there was this resistance. And we attempted to still march the next day, and the police threw a barricade across Lynch Street. I don't know if any of you, those who've been to Jackson, G.R. Lynch was named for a black state representative during Reconstruction. But we attempted to march through the black neighborhood and said, put the dogs on those GDNs. And we started running, and I was tear gassed in the back of the head and the back, and ran into this lady's little shotgun house, and she said, come in. She washed tear gas from my face and told me, go and sit on the front porch. And I went and sat on the porch like this, and here's the police running up and down the alleys with these dogs. You think about slavery time, and my people were running from these dogs. And so everyone got away. Some of the students, we were later told, were let under the house by white women who were at home, and they put them under their houses to protect them because they didn't go along, everybody didn't go along with what happened. So at dusk dark, made it back to the campus. The president had an early spring break, then later school was out. But I'm telling you that was my introduction to passive resistance and to demonstration. That was before I met Diane Nash, James Bevel, and many of the freedom, John Lewis and all the freedom riders who were on the freedom rides. And when I met them, it was like, oh my God, I've been looking for you for so long. Yeah, they were in the Masonic Temple, 5 more minutes. Okay, and met them and started going to meetings with them and learning how to organize and do voter registration. And at Tougaloo, they were very liberal, so as long as we kept up with our classwork. And I joined up with, I told Mother, that's my second year in college, I said, Mother, I had a little orange suitcase. Mother, I'm going to go to Jackson and join up with Bob Moses and get my freedom. And I ran out the door and went to the Greyhound bus station, went to Jackson, and that was history because after then Mother couldn't control me at all. But she never said no, but I wanted to get my freedom and I was on my way. So after then, we went to the Delta Council of Federated Organization called COFO, was organized in 1962, August of 1962. I was exposed to sundown laws in Clarksdale where Negroes were not on the streets after 12 midnight, and I had never heard of that. We went to Cleveland, Mississippi, met Miss Fannie Lou Hamer, who was living in servitude as a sharecropper. We took her to the courthouse to register to vote in Indianola. Bevel and Diane was staying at Amson Moore's house there in Cleveland. And after that, I went back to James Merritt, who was trying to enroll in Ole Miss, and I went to Nashville. I observed Mary King, Bobby Yancey, Connie Curry, and I saw Bernice Reagan and Miss Ella Baker, and all the students from the Albany movement. And I'm sitting there looking at them, and because we'd been part of a demonstration in downtown Nashville, and was like, oh, I want to be part of them. So, but Miss Hamer was also in the car. Miss Hamer was very daring and adventurous. You know, we were going a drop of a hat. And I was disappointed to say that some of the young people said they didn't want to be part of SNCC, but SNCC was one of the most courageous organizations that I could ever think of, because we went where men didn't dare tread. We were faced with death every day, and I still don't like to ride in the front seat of a car, and I don't sit near doors and just all kinds of things that happen. But I dropped out of school that fall, and I went to Chicago. I was talking to Heather about my first time going into a white home in Chicago, the Fishers, who entertained everybody, let everybody stay at their home. Charlie and Sylvia Fisher. Charlie was very active with the packing house workers and allowed us to stay there. And I went there to visit Mr. Kennard before he died from cancer. And they were very, very good to us. I couldn't believe it. And so I went back to Mississippi. Meg Evans was killed June 12, 1963. And my journey continued. I must say that I don't think there was a demonstration or anything that happened that I wasn't really a part of, because I have this desire in my heart to make things right for humanity, for mankind. It's not for any one particular color or one particular sex, but I do think that women have gotten their rights, and I think that we have to emphasize that. See, when I started out, I was the only female with these guys, with Lawrence Guillot, with Bob Moses, Chuck McDo, all of them. I went to nationals with Chuck, but I was the only female, and I had been trained not to sleep with men and so forth. So it wasn't an issue of you're gonna have sex with these guys. That was no, we couldn't work together. We were gonna sleep together. So we lived in the freedom houses, and we got along very well. But I couldn't drive, but they looked after me in that aspect. I just always sat in the back of the car. And going to Natchez, Mississippi with Chuck McDo and George Green, we had the unbelievable time of going to bed without, I have 3 minutes, going to bed without knowing if you're going to wake up, because the Justice Department was sending the 2 young white men down with sawed-off shotguns. They showed it to us, saying that they were afraid to come down there because they were afraid for their own lives. And that following week, they attempted to blow our office up in Natchez, but the chief of police said that you all aren't dead yet. And so I walked up to, at the night of the bombing, I went to the fire chief. He had a white shirt on. I said, whose house is that? We had all these Freedom Now signs on the houses and so forth. And he said, that bomb wasn't meant for that house. That bomb was meant for that house. I said, really? And so we had to go in and get the names of the people out, because I felt so protective of the people who had signed up with us. We didn't want them exposed to danger. Went in and came out through this mob, but Mr. Curtis, the funeral director, had a gun, and we walked through the mob, and I was in with this woman. We got back to the house, Mr. Metcalf's boarding house. He was president of NAACP, and the phone started ringing. May I speak to Dorie? Yeah, hello. Hey, Dorie, you so-and-so, B, and so-and-so. After she called about 3 times, I said, you know what, Little Richard is coming to town. He is. I said, yes. I said, if you don't call me anymore, I'll get you a ticket. You will? I said, yes. She said, okay, Dorie, I won't call you anymore. But that was just part of the trauma that we went through. And I will pass it on. And thank you. Thank you.
Did you get her that ticket?
Will this microphone pin on me?
And he wasn't coming.
Does it pick up like this?
Yes.
Is that good enough?
Yeah, fine.
Somebody said you can't hear me?
We can.
You can? Okay, fine.
I'm just gonna move this one so I can hear you.
I'm just a little bit more comfortable standing up. I can breathe better, protect my voice.
Can you do it?
Um,
I can't, I'll find somebody can.
That would be great.
As a result of several of the comments that I heard yesterday, where people who are teaching who said that their students have been so put off by the famous Stokely Carmichael comment that they would rather study the Black Panther movement, I completely reorganized my comments for this morning. And I consulted with my fellow panelists and decided that one of the things I need to do is bring a little clarity here on what actually happened. So what I want to begin with saying is that for me, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was the closest that I shall ever be in my life to real democracy. We made all of our decisions by consensus. It wasn't very neat, but it was a profound experience. And virtually everything I have done since is based on what I learned about social power during those 4 years working for SNCC. So when I was 22 years old at Ohio Wesleyan, I was part of the campus YWCA, which organized a trip to Atlanta and Nashville. And in Atlanta, I met Ella Baker, who would literally change my life. In Nashville, I met John Lewis and Diane Nash and Bernard Lafayette. And just as Dorie said, I wanted to be with them. When I went back to Wesleyan, amazingly, there was a phone call asking if I would please come to North Carolina and be interviewed by Ella Baker and Howard Zinn. So I got on a plane and went to North Carolina not knowing why they wanted to interview me. And to make a long story short, I was hired to work for a national student YWCA, Human Rights Project. And I would work for 1 year with Miss Baker, and I replaced Casey, who had been the staff person. Now, one of the most important things that I learned from Ella Baker was let the oppressed define their own freedom. And I've operated on that principle ever since. But Casey and I both came out of the YWCA, and it had a long-term commitment to eradication of racism. It was also dedicated to the development of leadership among women and girls. This was very important for me because it combined aiming for something big, like eradication of racism, with the development of leadership for women and girls. Well, at the end of that year project, Jim Foreman, who was the executive secretary for SNCC, invited me onto staff, and he sent me to Danville, Virginia to be in charge of communications. I said, Jim, I don't even know how to write a press release. He said, oh, don't worry, you will. This is very indicative of SNCC. I soon did learn how to write a press release. So let me say just a few words about SNCC, because yesterday I also found out that some people don't really know what that organization was. On February 1st, 1960, 4 black students in Greensboro, North Carolina, had an all-night debate and decided that they would go downtown to the Woolworths the next day, ask for coffee, and when they would be refused, just stay. They did not know the word sit-in. And the newspapers at the time wrote about it as a sit-down. They stayed, and they were arrested and so on. But what we did not know at the time is that in Nashville, there was a group of students who had been working with the Reverend James Lawson. Every week, on a Monday evening, he would have a workshop for the students from Nashville's institutions of higher learning. He had spent 3 years in India teaching, and had spent a lot of time visiting the sites of the various Gandhian struggles, had really come to understand the theories and methods of nonviolent civil resistance. And he grounded the group of Nashville students in a profound understanding of nonviolent action. I believe that this is the reason for SNCC's nonviolent militancy. It was that at the core, there was an extremely highly prepared group in Nashville, whose leader was Diane Nash, who had been schooled in the theories and methods of nonviolent action. So when a phone call came to Nashville saying what was happening in Greensboro, 75 students moved into action, sitting in. Now, those sit-ins blazed across the South, except for Mississippi. In 2 months, there had been student sit-in campaigns in 75 cities. Just, remember these are 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds, maybe some were 22. By the year's end, 70,000 had sat in. 3,600 had gone to jail. I remember John Lewis telling me the worst thing could happen to him and his family was to go to jail. Oh, he went to jail probably 100 times but before he got to the Congress, but at any rate, 3,600 young people, mostly black, but increasingly white, also had experience in jail by the end of 1960. Miss Baker brought all the leaders of the sit-in movements, the diverse campaigns, together at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina in April 1960. And they formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to do literally just that, to coordinate among the various sit-in leaders. Now, this is how SNCC was able, hear me closely, to create a mass base and South-wide reach for what would eventually become a mass movement involving tens of thousands. Because what we had before that was the Montgomery bus boycott, which was against one system in one city using one method. That's not a movement. That's a campaign, that was a boycott. What gave the web, the networks that provided the base for a regional movement were the student sit-ins. Now, for those of us who were working in SNCC, and particularly the women who participated in SNCC, this was where we gained incredible knowledge, training, skills. We learned how to organize. Everything was localized and decentralized. Local movements. There was no women's wing. There was no women's auxiliary. This was often, though, the first nurturing that women and girls had had in the development of their leadership skills. Ms. Baker thought that church experience often made women subservient because they were doing things like preparing the flowers. That was her opinion. I'm just saying that in passing. But in the movement, women were thrown into positions. We were always being thrown into positions where we had to assume leadership. And women were also the backbone of the organizing. Now, in November 1963, Lawrence Guyot, whom Dorie mentioned, created with other people the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. This was an alternative or parallel party to the racist regular Democratic Party. This is a straight out of Gandhi's playbook. The idea that if you have a problem that's so big that you can't solve it with methods like demonstrations and petitions and so on, you create an alternative institution, move out of the old into the new, and begin to enact your values and your goals now, even though you're still in the old order. So that was the thesis of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, called the MFDP. So the MFDP decided to hold a mock ballot in November 1963 in Mississippi. Because of course all of the racist authorities were saying, oh, the black people, they're happy, they don't want to vote. And so Guyot and the others said, we're going to prove to the country Mississippi black citizens want to vote. 5 congressional districts in Mississippi. In the 2nd district, we put up Fannie Lou Hamer. In the 3rd district, we put up Annie Devine. In the 5th district, where Dorie's from, we put up Victoria Jackson Gray. Now, hear me. 5 congressional districts. Out of those 5 congressional districts, SNCC, the SNCC workers in the MFDP and COFO, put up 3 women out of 5 candidates. That's 1963. SNCC was not nirvana, it was not perfection, but it was way ahead of the rest of the country and had a profound commitment to the involvement, development, and leadership of women. Now, June is coming up and it marks the 50th anniversary of the Mississippi Freedom Summer. And several people who were very critical for us had been killed in southern Mississippi. We decided to alter the scale of magnitude on which we were working. This was Bob Moses of SNCC and Dave Dennis of CORE, who formed the Council of Federated Organizations and decided to recruit 1,000 volunteers from across the country. They would run 38 freedom schools, work in voter registration and community centers. On June 21st, 3 of my fellow workers, our fellow workers, were killed, were murdered by law officers. In Atlanta, millions watched Fannie Lou Hamer testify as the formal challenge from the MFDP was presented to the all-white Democratic National, challenge to the all-white Mississippi Party, presented to the National Democratic Party. And the documentation was enormous. But the MFDP was only offered 2 seats, and it turned down the compromise. The dismay and discouragement in the staff was very profound. Jim Foreman, the executive secretary, decided to convene a staff retreat in Waveland and encouraged all of the staff to submit a position paper. Casey and I decided to write a position paper, but we were afraid of ridicule, and so we submitted it anonymously with no name. And it was at heart asking if SNCC's ideals of democracy and leadership didn't also mean being open to the concerns of women. It had a semi-facetious tinge, and the title of the paper was "The Position of Women in SNCC." So one night at the staff retreat, a bunch of us went out on a pier with some wine, and Stokely Carmichael, who was like a stand-up comedian, he could go on for hours with humorous, usually self-deprecating humor. He started out cracking jokes about himself. He went on to Trini's, he was from Trinidad. He cracked jokes about Black Mississippians. He made fun of everything, anything. Finally, he turned to the staff meetings. By now, Casey's and my paper was no longer anonymous. People had figured out who had written it. Stokely looked straight at me and he said, "What is the position of women in SNCC?" "The position of women in SNCC is prone." It was an absolutely hilarious, outrageous moment. We were all literally holding our sides on the pier when he said this. But it comes at the end of what begins with complete self-deprecation of himself and deprecation of everyone else. And Casey and I felt that at that moment, he was actually making fun of some of his own attitudes. I feel that way today. A year later, Casey and I wrote a paper called Sex and Caste, which you have in your hands. We sent it to 40 women across the country. And those 40 women began circulating it, resulting in what is now called consciousness raising groups. In 1970, Robin Morgan's book, Sisterhood is Powerful, reported that that paper had been written by Ruby Doris Smith Robinson, one of our fellow SNCC workers. Now, that was not true. But it was only the first of many errors about this paper that you have in your hand. The latest is in Peniel Joseph's book about Stokely that has just come out, in which he calls this paper that you have in your hands, he says it was written in 1964, and there's a whole bunch of other errors. He says that Stokely was replying to somebody, no understanding that this was part of a context of a huge, long monologue of Stokely's. So the historiography is really an issue, and I see we've been joined by one of the historians yesterday. I'm speaking from your panel and the concerns about the dreadful historiography that's gone on. So in our interracial struggle in SNCC, men were often spokespersons or public orators, but in my view, women were the central driving force at the grassroots. And women, some white, some black, who had been working in the civil rights movement, would gather knowledge, skills, learning, deep learning, and also please understand that in the context of a group of 200 staff people who were self-selected and had incredible audacity, that is what gave Casey and me the strength to float something and say, well, there are some other concerns that our movement might like to take advantage of, even though we were afraid of ridicule and didn't sign it. But it comes from within that context of that profound learning. So the civil rights movement would be transformative, as social movements always are. I've since gone on and studied and written case studies for many movements, many of them national, that have produced profound alterations, toppled dictators, brought about democracy, major changes. The civil rights movement would be transformative and open political space for other constituencies, such as those working against the war in Vietnam and the embryonic environmental preservation movement. Now, I would just like to make 2 other quick points, since I only have 1 minute left. I believe that it is still an issue that many women of ethnic or minority derivation, when they hear people talking about women's rights, don't think that that necessarily includes them. I would like to see much more work on this. We're not talking about equal pay for all the lawyers in the boardroom, for goodness sake. We are talking very, very, very deep, critical issues of social reform needed in this country. Secondly, someone in the historians panel yesterday made the point that we have to define women's rights. We will never define women's rights. Let me explain. A few years ago, I was meeting with a group of women in Appalachia. I asked them, what is your number one women's right issue? What is your top concern? They said, oh, driver's education. I said, what? Yes, if we can't drive and we don't have driver's licenses, we can't get out of the hollows when our drunken husbands start to beat us and the children. That was their number one women's rights. So this question will always remain open for the oppressed to define their own freedom.
You can see why I say these women are my sheroes. They have changed America. They changed and inspired a movement, civil rights movement. They have changed and inspired me, all of them. I'm going to talk just a little about that. Don't need the mic? Because I thought that with the feedback, it might be better without. Is that okay in the back? Definitely. We learned the lesson from SNCC and from the civil rights movement, the fundamental lesson that if we organize, we can change the world, and we have to organize if we want to change the world. I came into the civil rights movement in part from a family who shared those values of believing in freedom and justice and democracy and that people should be treated with dignity and respect. I was deeply moved by seeing the pictures of Emmett Till, 14-year-old from Chicago, who was beaten and killed when he visited his aunt in Mississippi and so-called whistled at a white woman and then was murdered for that. Whatever the exact story was, his battered body had a deep impact on me and many, many other people. It sparked many people around the country. In 1960, when I was 15, I became active in the movement directly in support of the demonstrations at Woolworths that Dorie mentioned that wouldn't seat African Americans at the lunch counters in the South, and that movement that took off around the country, just as Mary said. In 1964, as an 18-year-old, I went to Mississippi with a Freedom Summer Project. The 50th anniversary is coming up, just again as Mary said. In that summer, we were doing voter registration in freedom schools. We were jailed during the voter registration effort and so moved into registering people for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. All the while, we were learning from the local people of Mississippi, from Dorie, people like Dorie. And that's an important lesson I've tried to retain the rest of my life. The local people were the heart of the movement, and the women were the backbone of that heart. Mrs. Hamer, Ella Baker, Dorie and Joyce Ladner, Diane Nash, Casey Hayden, Mary King, Dorothy Burlage, and many, many others. I lived in one house with Mary Lou and Andrew Hawkins in Shaw, Mississippi. The family challenged the city of Shaw on what some think may be as significant a lawsuit as Brown versus the Board of Education. It said that improvements couldn't be made in the white part of town if you didn't make comparable improvements in the black part of town. And this was at a time when there were outhouses in the black part of town, they're not in the white, because there was no sewer line connecting from the bathrooms into the sewers. There was no paved roads, there were no lights in the black part of town. though there were in the white. In likely retribution for that suit, the Hawkins family home was firebombed twice. On the second bombing, a son and 2 grandchildren were killed. And just shortly later, a policeman came to the house and shot Mrs. Hawkins dead. Those were never seriously investigated, and more than that, and the reason I mention it here, is here are 4 deaths in one family, likely attributed because of their work on civil rights. I bet no one in this audience had heard about it before. It just gives a sense of the kind of terror that people lived with, that Dorie lived with in Mississippi particularly. After the summer of '64, even when it looked the most hopeless, we did win the Voting Rights Act. And it helped to change the conscience of a nation. It also changed ourselves because we stood up. We learned from poor black people in Mississippi that we need to act with moral conviction. You can act with courage. You can stand up to unjust laws even when you're frightened. But you can act so that people will be free and live with dignity and respect. And if we organize, when we organize, we can change the world. At the end of the summer, I returned to my campus at the University of Chicago and continued to chair the Friends of SNCC on the campus. And Dorie and I think we passed at that home that she was describing with the Friends of SNCC in Chicago. A friend of mine from the summer project told me that she was pregnant in a pregnancy she felt she could not go ahead with. This was also at my university. And she said she was suicidal and wanted an abortion. I hadn't thought about the issue before. This was 1965. I tried to find a doctor and went to the Medical Committee for Human Rights, the medical arm of the civil rights movement, and found a Dr. T.R.M. Howard. By the way, there's a book that was written on him about 5 years ago called Black Maverick. It's an extraordinary book. I hadn't known his full history. He'd been a freedom fighter in Mississippi, came to Chicago when his name appeared on a Klan death list, and had opened up a women's health clinic. He performed the abortion on my friend. I didn't think another thing about it, went on with my life, but then word had spread and someone else called me. We made the arrangement and word spread and someone else called, and I realized this is actually a problem we have to deal with. I didn't know, as you probably do, that 1 in 3 women of reproductive age will have an abortion at some point in their life. 1 in 3, so you go 1, 2, 3, so, oh, 1, 2. So we set up a system. We called it Jane. There's now a book, a play, and a movie about that, and some other things in development. The women of Jane between 1965 and 1973, when Roe became the law of the land, legalizing abortion, the women themselves in Jane performed 11,000 abortions. There were links between the civil rights movement and the women's movement, inspiring the women's movement in many parts, teaching us about courage and organizing, and also direct connections. At my school, I increasingly was exploring the role of women in the movement in the society, and a professor of mine, Dick Flax, who also had been in the founding group of the Students for a Democratic Society, encouraged me to attend my first SDS meeting, which was in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, in December 1965, because they were going to discuss there the woman question. There were people from SNCC. Dorothy says that she was there. We were all there together. It was an exciting conference, lots of debate back and forth, issues of civil rights, the war in Vietnam, students' rights, how can we work with SNCC, where are things going, the movement to oppose how students were treated in the universities in lieu of parents, this is called in loco parentis. And I think one of the papers that we read was Sex and Caste by Mary King and Casey Hayden, which suggested that women meet as women, that we consider particularly women's role. And it was stunning to see the experiences we had only thought about alone and in isolation, named, written down, and raising our awareness. I've been ever grateful. One of the reasons I was so grateful to be on this panel was to thank Mary in public for the kind of impact that she had. So we began discussing the woman question. there were several hundred, it seemed to me, several hundred people sort of talking about it, and it was going on for hours. When the women would say some things like, well, I didn't feel that I was being listened to by the men, or I was just told your role is to get the coffee. The men would then say, oh no, that's not true. Oh no, we didn't do that. Oh no, you didn't try that. And just denying our reality. Then Jimmy Garrett, one of the African-American SNCC organizers who had, he was running the LA office of SNCC, he got up with two of his friends and he said, look, you women aren't going to get it together until you just talk amongst yourselves. You don't really want the men here. And so he left. Now at first when he left, I looked at that and I thought, oh no, this is a movement of black and white together, men and women together. We're going to work this out. About another hour went on, and I realized he was really right. Again, I learned from SNCC. And I led a walkout of the women who just realized that we needed to talk together. And so we started to define our own voice as women.
Heather, explain what you mean when you say, I led a walkout.
Yeah, I remember.
Well, Dorothy, you say what happened.
Oh, no, you, go ahead.
I was in the group and I felt it's not effective doing this. So those women who want to come and talk amongst ourselves, let's go into this other room.
I would like to say it was revolutionary.
You stood up, and what exactly happened? You stood up, walked out?
Yes, there's another walkout that I'm going to describe in just a minute. But yes, so I stood up, and then the women who wanted to went into another room. And then we focused on, we said, look, we've talked about many of the issues. Now let's talk about what we're going to do about it. And we committed that when we'd go back to our home communities, we would organize other discussion groups that would also combine discussion and action. Within a year, I had started over 10 of these groups, both consciousness raising and action projects. This again is 65 into 1966. Back on my campus at an SDS meeting, while I was talking, one of the men told me, shut up. I finished speaking, walked around and tapped every woman on her shoulder in the circle. It was a large group. We all walked upstairs and founded what was probably the first campus women's organization, and left the other organization behind, and founded what we call the what's it called? Radical Women's Radical Action Program. I could remember the initials. I forgot what it stood for. And it really was great, and did many effective projects on campus. And then was expanded into the city and became one of the elements that led into the creation later of the Chicago Women's Liberation Union. We were on a panel about that. I see Judy say it here, and maybe there are others from the Chicago group there. So all of this was possible because we organized, because we built on the lessons that we had learned from SNCC, that you listen to local people's concerns. You really listen to what people care about. You have to listen to what women care about. We even need to listen to what we care about ourselves. You need to stand up. You need to trust each other. We need to trust ourselves. We can stand up against illegitimate power. We can act with courage, even when we're afraid. All the movements we also realized are related. Civil rights, women's rights, the right to vote, the right against these voter suppression laws, the rights for LGBT community, the right for an economy that works for all of us, for immigration reform and more. It's all part of a broader movement. And I come to this conference still believing in that broader movement, still believing in what many in SNCC call the beloved community, and with a debt of gratitude to the civil rights movement for what I learned from it, that if we organize, we can change the world, and such a debt of gratitude to these sheroes who have changed the world, helped to change me, and are partners in the struggle, along with all of you, for building a better world. We thank you all. What I wanted to show, I think it's a small enough room I can show you. These are just 3 pictures from Mississippi I'm playing a guitar with, this is at Fannie Lou Hamer's house in Rollville. And here I am at 18 with a guitar. Here's Fannie Lou, Mrs. Hamer, and two of her friends in front of her house. Maybe that it's just too small in the back to see. Can you see up front? Oh, up front you could see. Just two other pictures. This is when we were doing the MFDP, because we couldn't do the regular Democratic Party. We couldn't organize. By the way, the Republican Party was not a significant effort by then at that time, and that's it wasn't so much this partisan effort, but it was an attempt to have a voice in the party that mattered then. And here I am in a cotton field doing voter registration into the MFDP, just to give a sense of what the life was like then. And the last is a picture. We were at a demonstration while we were doing voter registration. We were arrested shortly after this, and it's one of the reasons that led to focusing on the MFDP organizing. Here I am with the Freedom Now sign. These pictures are on the CRM Vets website. That is an extraordinary, wonderful website. CRM Vets with an S .org, and it's civilrightsmovement.org. CRM Vets. It's a wonderful website. And the last thing I'd say is that, and I think this is true especially for white women. Dorie and I were trying to talk last night about this, and it may be more true for white women, but as a white woman, let's say my experience. I was frightened every moment of the time. Not just in Mississippi, where we were also frightened for our lives and frightened for us jeopardizing the lives of others who lived in Mississippi permanently. Maybe I was even more frightened for that. But there's a kind of fear in any kind of organizing where you wonder, will I know enough? Am I good enough? Will I say the right thing? Will I know what to do? And it's a fear that says, just built on our own insecurity. And one of the messages I really want to send out for, especially for younger women, is that I think making change isn't about not having fear, but finding the solidarity and sisterhood, especially with other women, to stand together, to work together, to organize together. In spite of that fear, to find new courage, to live our values, and to change the world.
Here's the mic. We don't have too much time, unfortunately. If you want to guide us, Debbie, on what we've got for time? Is it really 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Great, 12:30.
15 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you both.
This is, I think people can judge if they want to spend some of their lunchtime here. That would be good.
Okay, so if people want to spend some of the lunchtime, we can keep the conversation going. The first. Sorry, Sam?
Oh, maybe plug it back in, because I think the others are less of a loudmouth.
I'm pretty much of a loudmouth. I want to say that where were you when I joined Corps in 1960 in Syracuse, and was in the anti-war movement also, and went down to Mississippi for the Meredith March in 1966. And one of the reasons I left the United States was because of Stokely Carmichael, who got up when we were having talks, I think it might have been in Canton, Mississippi, and he was talking about the future of the movement, and he said, the only place for women in the movement is prone, and he was not joking, it was not a joke. And then he went on to say, you whites, we don't need you in the movement anymore. And it was, for me, a real shock. And I'm so sad that I didn't see the document that you wrote. I mean, that would make a difference. I don't think I would have left the United States if I felt that there was an alternative.
Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you, Marilyn. And I think you should know that the person who just asked this question established the first department of women's studies in Israel at the University of Haifa, if I got that right.
Right.
Yes, so you should know that. Well, you know, that march, that 1966 march, this is around the time that one of our fellow workers, Willie Ricks, jumped on a stage and cried out, "What do we want? Black power." And again, what do we want? Black power. And back came the name. This was the beginning of the breakdown of the interracial model, which had been so profound in SNCC. And eventually, SNCC would destroy itself. First, it would purge John Lewis and drive John Lewis out of the organization. It would purge and drive Julian Bond. Impossible to go into these things in detail. But all social movements contain, in my study of many years, contain within themselves the seeds of their own self-destruction if they are not working on planning for the long term. And one of the things that I do in teaching, because I work with students from all over the world, is to say, you must not postpone the issue of what do we do on the long term. You must bring it in right from the beginning. Your goal is not this transient objective. Your long-term goal, it requires a connection between the means and the ends. You see, he was departing in a most profound way from the underlying philosophical commitment to your means and your ends. The way you fight determines what the outcomes are. And once you begin race baiting or talking in an exclusionary way, you're no longer going to build a democracy that is authentic and real. Thank you for opening this. I noticed that Peniel Joseph, in his history, which has so many errors on just 2 pages about Stokely, he doesn't even treat Stokely's last 30 years.
Well, one of the things that was so hurtful to me was that Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy were standing there when Stokely made these comments, and they just let it pass by.
I've
For me,
never
that
heard
was
that
a double kind of thing.
There are lots of hands up. Maybe we'll take several hands and then respond to several at once, just because,
I think the people in the back were next. I don't know which of you.
People say
You.
their names when they
With a red vest.
I wanted to ask,
Do you want to give your name?
I'm Carol Giardina.
Thank you.
I was in North Florida. I was Civil Rights Corps, anyway. And then a deep and persistent supporter of Black Power, which I loved every moment of it. Felt very welcome, yeah, but that's not my question. My question is, our women in the Civil Rights Movement always called the backbone. When I think of women like Miss Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, Gloria Richardson, Diane Nash, they seem to me to have been leaders, you know,
Right,
in
right.
every sense.
Right.
Out in front, in your face, strong, bold, leading demonstrations into the depths of, you know,
Amen. We agree.
All them leaders that were
It's
women,
good-
women were
good-
the backbone, but there were lots
good-
of women
good
who were
point.
leaders too.
amen.
I'd like to say something in response to that, because COFO, for example, the Council of Federated Organizations, did not have a woman on its governing board. In many instances, the men were the public orators or public spokesperson for the movement.
there were many
But those of us who were actually working in the movement knew where the energy came from, knew who went door to door, understood that it was the women who were doing the organizing. And that was an insight that we developed as we went. We have now gone on to see that reiterated again and again and again, so there's now no disputing it. But at the time, it hadn't been proved in the social sciences. And observationally, we were at the beginning of the cusp of something.
I'm not saying that women were not the backbone and did not do that. I believe that. I saw it myself.
When
what
Col-
I'm saying is that additionally, look at I Question America. Fannie Lou Hamer giving that speech, she was leaving, and so was Gloria Richardson. They were out front doing the same thing men did, giving big public
We really need to move, there's a lot of hands up. Dorie?
Dorie Ladner was to
When
respond.
when COFA was organized in August of 1962 in Clarksdale, Mississippi, Coley Liddell was the secretary. Aaron Henry was president. I'm not sure what happened after that, but she was secretary. And Coley was from Jackson, Mississippi, and she married Bernard Lafayette. She was a Tougaloo College student, a native of Jackson, Mississippi.
Oh, that was Collier. Okay, who had their hand up next? With the red coat?
This question is for Dorie and Mayor King. I just wanted you to share a little bit more about your reflections on Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer. And then I want to know if you all are writing any books.
What's your name?
I'm Mary Phillips.
They both were very strong women, and had a world view, as far as I'm concerned, were very interested in the community. I met Miss Hamer in Ruleville, Mississippi, and she was a sharecropper. I was there the night that she was kicked off the plantation. We'd been at the courthouse all day, and they didn't get registered to vote, but she came, Cola and I was, Cola Liddell, the same one I'm talking about, was there, and she came to us crying and said Mr. Mallory kicked him off the plantation. We hugged, put her in a circle and started singing there in the church. She exemplified for me a woman who had lived through slavery and who had was a Harriet Tubman who wanted to get freedom and was going to get it by any means necessary. Miss Baker had the same passion. Miss Baker was inclusive. Miss Baker had been exposed to much more than Miss Hamer. Miss Baker had finished college, had lived in Harlem, had been part of the Renaissance, and she had a world vision. And Miss Hamer's was limited, but her scope, if you saw her at the Democratic Convention, the way she spoke, you could see that she had many, many ideas and had lived a much longer life than she exemplified. So I would equate the two of them together.
I would like to say that Fannie Lou Hamer probably had more what I would call personal power than anybody I have ever known or worked with. It all came from within her. She barely had basic numeracy and literacy, but when she would stand up and begin to sing, the entire group, who however many hundreds there were in her hands. I'd like to recommend, as one of many books, that you read this book. There's a lot about Ella Baker in it, because Ella Baker was so influential for us in her philosophy of leadership. She was the one who kept urging that women needed to be brought into leadership. She's part of the reason that happened in that mock ballot in November 1963. And everything that she did was designed toward, she said she believed in not leader-led groups, but group-led leaders.
Right.
What about Hands on the Freedom Plow?
Yes, also read Hands on the Freedom Plow. 52 chapters.
The question in the back? That's you.
Well,
Please identify yourself.
okay, I'm Kathy Sarah-Child, and
Who was a volunteer in?
I was a volunteer in Mississippi in 1964, Batesville, a little rural county and a fairly safe county, though. Anyway, I won't go into all the details. That's the problem with these conferences. Which details do you go into? And which don't you? And that's sort of why I waited until everybody else had spoken. I mean, I wish we had time for a back and forth. Whenever it's time for a back and forth to get into some of these issues. But I'll try, I mean, like I'd like to, I think Carol and Mary were talking about an interesting opposite that's really the same about how, what does leadership really mean, going first, being brave, or being the public voice, but, you know, we don't have time to go into that, I'm just going to be, but what I would like to just say, of all the things, you know, is that I think that this issue of what happened with Stokely Carmichael's quip, and there does seem to be evidence that it was made more than once, you know, I didn't hear it made more than once, is both that, you know, it's both fascinating and I guess you could say it was horrifying. Now, when I heard about it, and this is kind of the problem of is it a problem of historiography? Partly it's a problem of the positive and negatives of rumors when issues are ripe. Because I heard it as a rumor, not as historiography, and quite close to the time it occurred. When I went back to Mississippi, I don't think you remember this, Mary, but you and Emmy Schrader recruited me to go back to Mississippi in 1965 to work on the film strip project. And that's
I do remember that.
Oh, you do? Anyway, when I got back down there in March of 1965, a white guy on the project, Chris Williams, came running up to me because he knew I was interested in the woman because I had been fighting on the project with men to share the house with. And by the way, the woman question, we all thought it was a Communist Party term. I've now found evidence of William Lloyd Garrison eloquently defending what he called the woman question in 1837 in the anti-slavery movement. So it goes way back. It's not just, and that term goes way back. But anyway, so it was a rumor. Chris came running to me and said, "Oh, Kathy, you'll hear that there's now women's liberation being talked about in SNCC." And this is where I heard the Ruby Doris Robinson rumor. And I do think I heard that Mary and Casey had written the paper, but that what I heard, I wrote this down at pretty close to the time. That's another thing. How close to the time do you actually write things down or tell them? Because the longer it takes, the less you remember it right, if you remember it at all. Anyway, I think he said Ruby Doris Robinson stood up and read the speech. But anyway, he came and he said, "Oh gosh," and Stokely, and everyone was talking about it, and Stokely joked about women in the position of being in the movement were prone. Now, when I heard that, I thought that's both funny and terrible, but I also knew very good things about Stokely. Yeah. I mean, good feminist things. For instance, that he had been one of the few guys who shared the housework, and I also knew, the way I knew that is that he came in and he offered to wash the dishes after a big Sunday dinner. So, and I also knew that I had, I've said this before, but I'll say it again, that I knew I was in radical movement organizations before, and it was always a problem with all men getting them to share the housework. It was nothing new. What was new was this term, women's liberation. So anyway,
by the way, excuse me,
yes.
I have a lunch appointment, and so I have to leave, but I value you all, my sisters. Thank you for being here. I'm not even trying to cut you off, I have to leave and wanted to say thank you all.
Okay, thanks. The thing is, how do, we've had the problem in women's liberation of how do you criticize, especially movement men who are our allies, and black movement men get it even worse, for being male chauvinists and people not hearing, that's radical men, or that's black men who are like that. It's a really tough thing.
I want to speak to this for a second. We had a SNCC reunion, I think in 1988, and Julian Bond got up and he said, "Look, we lived in the 1960s. This was before we knew anything about women, and we reflected the reality of that time." And so you had a contradiction, as Mary tried to point out. On the one hand, we were living at a time that was sexist and patriarchal, and women were subdued. And on the other hand, as Mary and Dorie and Heather exemplify, it was a time when women could thrive. When we did things that nobody would have ever thought we could do. I ran my own voter registrations project. Anything I wanted to do, I got to do, if I had the guts to do it, which I didn't always have. But I think it's a very complicated period of time, and you can't just dismiss it by saying Stokely said this. What if he did say it?
Yes,
Who
so
cares?
what?
It's like history, we went on, we got past him, women organized.
Thank you. Thank you.
grab the mic,
Yeah,
grab the
okay.
mic.
And if people need to leave too, but everyone who wants to keep talking, that's great.
Feel free to leave if you have to, but we'll stay, for those who want to stay.
Okay, my name is Laura Foner, and I was a SNCC staff person in Arkansas in 1965 and 66, so on the later, the later end. And I mean, I have a lot of things to say, but
You agree with what I said?
yeah, I agree with what you said. It's never like one, it's always complicated. It's always more complicated than we think it's gonna be, and particularly around these issues. I mean, what more complicated things are we still trying to figure out about race and class and sex and how to build a revolutionary movement for fundamental transformation? We're all trying to figure that out, and there are no easy answers, and so we learn from our experiences. And I just want to say, everyone dealt with that period differently. I was in SNCC in 66 when Stokely was elected chairperson. I was actually, like you, extremely excited, even though it meant that I was no longer going to be working in the field as I was, and had to then figure out what my role was. But it was I had to think profoundly about what to do next and how I could contribute to building the movement. And so I tried to do that in the best way I could, but I took the lessons that you're all talking about from SNCC, which was amazing, and I feel like, was incredibly inspiring into the rest of my life, my lifetime of organizing that I still do. And I just want to say that I want to re-emphasize what you said about the strength of women coming from the local communities. It was, part of that was the men were gone. Where I was working, there were very few men. Most of them were old or children because there were no jobs. So they had left and gone to the cities. So the leader, that wasn't the only reason, but that was one piece of it. The women were the leaders of the local organization that we worked with, and they were incredibly inspiring to me. And I feel like the story of those women need to be told. And a lot of people don't know their names. People don't know who they are. People know a few more now, but not enough.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Other hands.
Well, I just feel like throwing something else into the pot here, and because in my community in Batesville, Mississippi, the men were the leaders, probably because it was one of the few areas where there were black farmers. The hill country, there were a lot of black farmers who owned their own land, and they had organized suit. We were told at the Oxford orientation session that in this community, we were not to pay our own way, we volunteers, because we were told we're not to pay our own way because in that community, there was already a local organization the local organization had initiated a suit. Anyway, I won't go into all the details, and the SNCC leaders, our SNCC leaders, had wanted the community to continue to support civil rights workers. We had been, invited in. But anyway, my point about the women leaders, in that county, the men had been the leaders of the church that had initiated the suit and everything. And they continued. I think maybe there was one woman leader of the middle class or landowning African Americans, but on the plantations, which were much harder to organize, where things were even worse, I think you could say that it was a couple, a man and woman couple that were the leaders of the groups on the plantation that got together and dared to go register, because then you could be kicked off the land. So it's a mixed thing about who were the leaders. It was patriarchal there.
In the communities, for the most part, the women were the people who did the organizing, because, as you said, the men were either working or had left the area for various reasons. The women kept the houses going, and during that period, women were in the background for the most part. And they kept things going in your Freedom House. I know in Greenwood, Mississippi, Mrs. Johnson did the cooking at the Freedom House and various places in the churches. When Miss Heyman was kicked off the plantation, the women came to her aid, and she was housed with the McDonald's. Mrs. McDonald invited her into the home. You know, it was very formal, more or less. We were very traditional, church-going people, and so very respectful. And I don't know, but in the churches that I grew up in, the women were more or less in positions of power behind the throne, so to speak, as they are in this country, in Israel and other countries. So I would say that, and getting to Stokely, he's dead, God bless him. May we let him rest in peace. But I had no idea that this conversation would have gone to 1966, which I've never seen it documented that he made that statement. I know about Black Power, but as you quoted Julian as saying, that was at that particular juncture in time, Kathy. So maybe let it rest and move forward. And that is my position.
I want to add one thing that is sort of embarrassing to talk about, and I stand ready for Dorie to correct me. But as a white person growing up in the South, in a segregated family with a history of what I would call indentured servants in my family, black people who didn't dare leave the place because they would have not made it out of the county. My impression, Dorie, was that black women, first of all, they were in the house. So they knew everything we were doing. They knew more about the interactions in the family. They were like the telephone switchboard. I mean, you know, who was sleeping with who, and who just was going to get divorced, and who was drinking, and did so-and-so stay out too late that night. I mean, they knew everything. And were substitute mothers. When the black men were working out either in the yards or in the fields or someplace, and were much more vulnerable to getting killed. And so I thought myself that black women always had more power because of being basically privy to the information they got inside the house and being less prone to get killed. Does that resonate with your history, your experience?
Women did have a little more entree into the main power structure, and our men were protected by the families, because today they're still vulnerable. In stop and frisk in New York, I mean, you still have it. Trayvon Martin, men against killed Jasper, Texas, pulled behind a truck. That's why I can't sit here and let you talk about Stokely, but so much because he's a black man. So I'm going to come to his defense. But the point is that the women were in the house for many reasons, cooking and taking care of the children, taking on the role of the surrogate mother and raising the children. And the men were outside of the house somewhere trying to make a living. My mother never worked in the house because of that reason, because my stepfather didn't think that she should be in the home of someone else, but she should be in her own home. And I don't remember my aunts working in a home. My grandfather told each of his 11 children to work and take care of themselves. Don't work for anybody but yourself. I grew up in an independent family from that perspective. But I do know that traditionally, black men were at higher risk than women. And women were taken advantage of in the homes, and also paid lower wages and worked long hours. Christmas time, they had to prepare the Christmas dinner, right? And Thanksgiving dinner. Then they go home to their families. So we had a lot to contend with. And I think Heather asked me about feeling scared or something. I told her that we had to suck it up. We didn't have time to be scared. We had to go forward. we can't, we didn't have time to sit or go to counseling or guidance or think about, therapy or be neurotic. I mean, you had to, I started working for a white family when I was 12 years old. I made $5 a week. They were as poor as we were, but I made $5. But the point was that the church was our sanctuary. We would go to church and take our burdens to the Lord and leave them there. On the weekends, people would entertain themselves with beverages, with drink, with music. I live close to New Orleans. People go to New Orleans and party and have fun. But the Eagle flies on Friday and Saturday. You go out to play, but people would go to work on Monday morning. So you didn't have, but you had a limited arena in which to play. But whatever it was, you made the best of it. I know traditionally, when my grandmother moved back to Palmer's Crossing from Wayne County, Mississippi, each one of her children who were living in Hattiesburg would go there and visit her, or you would go and visit your relatives on Sunday to keep that tradition going. We don't have that now, but you would go and spend time with your family, and that was one way of taking care of yourself.
Anyone else?
Thank you.
It's a good audience.
Mary, I really, it just moves me so much, and I'm so